I think what we've seen across the board, all over the political landscape, is a whole new kind of crop of false pagan religions, pseudo-gods, people kneeling and begging for absolution at the feet of Black Lives Matter protesters, or Dr. Fauci claiming, I am the science. These are not political claims, they're not scientific claims, they're religious claims. They're attempts on the part of the human heart to fill that void of the highest good with science, with politics, with whatever, and wokeness has that character.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us today. We had a fascinating conversation for you with scholar and author Spencer Klavan about the crises facing Western civilization. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I do share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues that we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin, on the JNS channel, on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. It's difficult to look at contemporary society and not be troubled by what we see. The foundations of what we in the West have long viewed as our greatest treasures, our heritage of knowledge expressed in philosophy, religion, literature, art, and history, are all under siege. Now, that sense of crisis isn't new. Anyone with any knowledge of history knows that every generation feels itself embattled. But the problems we face today are different. A bloodless revolution has been going on inside the academy and our culture, and the generation that grew to maturity since the 1960s has, almost without fully understanding the consequences of their choices, set in motion changes in our educational system and cultural norms that have replaced traditional values with moral relativism and sought to discard the accumulated wisdom of Western civilization with a new faith that regards the achievements of the past as fatally tainted by its association with the flaws of our ancestors and their inability to live exactly according to the values of contemporary society. Yet instead of this making us less racist and more free, it has done the opposite. We live now in a country where virtually all of our institutions are governed by fear of transgressing against the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which rejects the goal of a society that is both colorblind and devoted to equality, and seeks to impose on us labels related to privilege and oppression that are essentially immutable. In the name of this new faith, our society's values are not only turned upside down, as our freedoms have been eroded. As we learned during the coronavirus pandemic, many of us no longer value our freedoms as highly as we do perceptions of safety or the need to conform. And as faith in religion declines, too many of us have replaced it with a sort of pagan belief in science without actually valuing the principles of inquiry and skepticism that is key to actual science, and rejecting those elements of scientific reality that do not conform to the intellectual fashions of our day. At the same time, we appear to have collectively fallen under the spell of the products of big tech, which, in cahoots with the government, has been abusing its enormous power that comes with the control of the virtual public square to shut down discussion or to impose their version of reality on us. Moreover, we also know that these discontents are linked to an even deeper spiritual crisis at the heart of our civilization that is difficult to define or fully articulate. The impact of these shifts have gutted our universities, made them hotbeds of intolerance where free speech and even civility toward those with whom we might disagree is thought of as the product of outmoded values and thinking. That same spirit of intolerance has spread to our popular culture and to our politics as we have become a bifurcated society in which the two sides in our liberal-conservative divide no longer trust or value each other or even concede that their foes might have good motives. Politics now plays the role that faith and religion once did in most people's lives, and we see how that has turned every dispute into a tribal cultural war. That has left many of us feeling that we have no choice but to go all in on these battles, and there is some truth to that. But even those most determined to fight culture wars know that this isn't solely about politics or faith, but a crisis caused by our abandonment of our moorings in our past and its achievements. That is why some thinkers believe that the true answer to our current problems may not be political, but rather reflect a need to return to the classic texts that provide the foundation for Western thought. The accumulated wisdom of the past may not tell us exactly how to solve our problems or to resolve our political disputes, but they do remind us of the basic skills and understandings that are the underpinnings of any such answers. Rather than more cable news debates, perhaps the study of the classics of Western civilization is the right place to turn if we are to find our way out of the current mess. That's what Spencer Klavan, the author of a new book that seeks to argue that ancient wisdom can give us some insight on modern crises, believes. So we have invited him to join us today, not so much to discuss Western philosophy, as to explore how the wisdom of Athens and Jerusalem, the twin poles of Western civilization, provide the keys for understanding our current dilemma. His How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for Five Modern Crises, gives both a taste of the treasures of Western civilization, as well as attempting to provide a template for how we can understand that they speak loudly to us today. Spencer Klavan is a scholar, writer, and podcaster, a graduate of Yale and Oxford University, where he studied the classics. He's an editor at the Claremont Institute, as well as having written for many outlets, including The Atlantic, Los Angeles Times, City Journal, Newsweek, the Claremont Review of Books, and The Federalist. Spencer Klavan, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan. It's great to be here.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I really look forward to this. It's an interesting book and a good read. And I want to start by asking you how you came to write this. You're someone who studied the classics, but as a writer and an editor, you're also someone who is immersed in the politics of the day. What, other than your own academic background, led you to the conclusion that what we need most right now is a book that, rather than speaking directly about our contemporary problems, tells its readers to go back to the treasures of Western civilization?
Sure. Well, it's really kind of a personal story for me because I don't talk a lot about this in the book itself, but I grew up in a house filled with books. I was incredibly lucky in that respect. I had to kind of grow up and learn that was weird, that not everybody was surrounded by bookshelves. And what I learned really quickly is that being surrounded by books means being surrounded by friends. You know, this sort of stuff gets represented a lot as fusty, old, superstitious, difficult to understand. You know, the classics of the West are kind of either too highfalutin to be of any use, or even worse, they're somehow prejudiced and evil and backward and wrong. And as I started to encounter that view more and more, I started to feel more profoundly how urgent some of these texts are. You know, these are some of the best things that have been thought and said about how to be excellent at being human, how to encounter sort of the primary questions that we come up against about our place in the universe. And, you know, those questions have been around for a long time, and the best answers to them aren't necessarily going to be the ones that come out of the news cycle today or tomorrow. And so as I left grad school, when I finished my doctorate, I started this podcast called Young Heretics. And the idea of the show was really simple. Just once a week, I was going to take a great work of Western literature and explain it, talk about it with the audience. Well, this will be a niche podcast. Nobody's got interest in this kind of obscure old book stuff that I like. But actually what I found really quickly is there was this huge hunger out there. People were so ready for something that could talk about modern life in a way that was more than just like, oh, this is what we're outraged about today. And that's really what the classics do. I think they dig beneath the surface of whatever's happening today or yesterday, beneath our 5-second memory span at this point. And they kind of offer up some thoughts about the deeper questions underlying our daily problems. And the eagerness that I found for that suggested to me people were actually really in need of something of substance, of voices and companionship from the past to help guide us into this crazy future. And that's what the book was born out of, was this sense of need and wanting to offer people an inroad to that great conversation, because it really is, it's there for us. It's not something to sort of be kept on the shelf or disregarded or shrugged off. It's actually urgently necessary for the daily problems that we encounter in our everyday lives, and that's what the book attempts to offer, is just to give people an inroad to that conversation.
Yeah. Now, when you speak of the West, because this is about how to save the West, what do you mean? Now, for the political left and the advocates of the woke DEI catechism of an intersectionality, the term is synonymous with the dead white males whom they not only think are not diverse enough, but on whom they blame all of our problems. What do you mean, and how do you provide a definition that somehow links what you term, Athens and Jerusalem?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I told a friend of mine that I was writing a book called How to Save the West, and she was like, oh, that's awesome. I love John Wayne movies. I'm really excited for that book. And I too love John Wayne movies.
Yeah, right. That would have been a good book too.
It would have been great. I leave it to somebody else. Free idea. You don't have to credit me. Just go write How to Save the Western. But that's not what this book is about, as you mentioned. When I use the term the West with a capital W, I'm talking about Athens and Jerusalem, as you indicated, these kind of two streams of tradition. And when I say Athens, that stands in for the great philosophers of Greece and Rome in the ancient world and their inheritors. And then when I say Jerusalem, I'm referring to the sort of two great monotheisms of the Near East, Judaism and Christianity, and the scriptures and traditions and wisdom literature that come down from that strand. And these two kind of streams of tradition really meet in Europe, through the Roman Empire. They get sort of disseminated across the world, and that essentially builds the world that we are currently living in still, even now, even as we try to suggest that this history is evil, that it's freighted with all sorts of, colonialism and racism and misogyny and backwards isms. Even the words that we use to accuse our ancestors of that evil, even those are inherited in some way, shape, or form from this cultural tradition of Athens and Jerusalem. And the whole idea that it might be bad to restrict yourself just to one race, to restrict yourself only to one nation, that idea too, that kind of cosmopolitan search for absolute truth beyond any one, restriction of blood or soil, that's a Western idea too, as it comes to us. We receive it from this tradition. And so it's not only arrogant, it's also profoundly lonely to toss that out and to say, well, now, out of the pure bliss of our common sense, just our God-given niceness, we're going to be better than all of that. What you learn very quickly as you start to study this stuff is these ideas aren't necessarily common sense in the sense of just dropping out of the sky. They had to be fought for and bled over and really wrestled with for a long time. And now we have this kind of whole faction that proposes to toss out this history, to reject this tradition because the ideas in it didn't sort of drop fully formed, weren't perfectly embodied the minute they were thought up. And so the American founders, the whole notion of Western civilization, this is backwards and white, as you sort of alluded to. But of course, these ideals, the whole point of them is that nobody ever lives up to them in their perfect state. And we're not going to do any better just by sort of scrapping them all and starting afresh. You and I don't live up to these ideals any more perfectly than our ancestors did. And certainly the kind of woke dogma, the woke cathedral, doesn't live up to them in the way that they claim to or hope to. So the idea behind the book is, look, you can certainly make critiques of the past. You can want to, perform any number of reforms. That's part of the Western tradition. But the idea that you're going to get further just by throwing the whole thing out, by tossing any kind of epithet at it, by accusing it of all these evil nasties and throwing it out the window, that it's an incredibly lonely way to proceed. It leaves you bereft of all the best that has been thought and said on these topics up until about 5 minutes ago.
Yeah. I guess the question is, and that's sort of the heavy lift for virtually everybody in the academy today, is does Western civilization have something for everyone? And sort of why are those who believe that is not diverse enough wrong? You quote W.E. Du Bois, the groundbreaking African-American thinker, philosopher, who spoke of his own connection with the great Western classics, even though, he was sort of born outside from the point of view of the people who believe in DEI. He should have utterly rejected them as having nothing to do with him. But that's not what sort of a thinking person ought to approach this.
Oh, absolutely. You could add to Du Bois, you could add Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and even Machiavelli in a famous letter from exile writes about communing in the kind of halls of the ancients with men like Cicero and Livy. And each of those guys, whatever their background, whatever their race, whatever their history, discovered that through these traditions, which do come from a particular time and place, of course, there's no getting around that, but through those traditions, we actually access truths which transcend any one time or place. That's the whole if there's any such thing as truth at all, and not just kind of your own relative convictions based on where you were born or, the color of your skin or whatever, if there's any truth that transcends that, then it must be the case that through the best that has been thought and said, we can get at something that we all actually can share, that it's the only route to anything that we all can share. I mean, Edmund Burke, the great British statesman, I think was really beautiful on this, because he was famous for insisting all the time that our truths come to us through our traditions. They're not disembodied. They didn't float in some airy, abstract space. We learn them over gradual processes of law and tradition and argument. And that's why, for instance, the French Revolution so offended him, because he didn't think you should just wipe the slate clean and start afresh. But at the same time, his other kind of major career move was to accuse the abusers of the of Indian, people in India, the East India Trading Company, William Pitt, and those who he felt had, overstepped the boundaries of their commission. He accused them by saying morality is not geographical. Morality has no geography. And so both of these things can be true. We approach these truths through our traditions. They come down to us in a certain form and in no other. But by entering into those traditions, we actually enter into a kind of communion that goes beyond all of the ways that the woke would like to divide us up, beyond race, gender, sexuality, all these things that are supposed to now be the be-all and end-all of our identity. There's actually only one route out of that, and ironically, it's the route that the woke most condemn, which is the route of the Western tradition.
Yeah. Why must we study these philosophers, theologians, Christian as well as Jewish, as well as writers and artists? Again, we go back to, it's very hard for people now to sort of think beyond the moment. And yet that is sort of the foundation of the education process that, we've inherited. But it's a really heavy lift for people today, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that's obviously going on, it's impossible to ignore, is this sea change in communications technology that we've all lived through. I mean, anybody but the youngest of us has seen dramatic changes in the way that we relate to one another, the kinds of conversations that we're able to have, the way we relate to space and time. You and I are having this conversation now with all sorts of tech interposed through all sorts of digital media. And there are obviously beautiful benefits to that. The fact that we're able to discuss these ideas, to access them, to record them, to put them out into the world. But all new technology has a powerful effect on the human mind. It reshapes us just as much as we make it. It reshapes us. And we weren't ready for this kind of change. I mean, David Bowie called it an alien invasion. And I think that's a really interesting way of describing it. It's on the level of the invention, let's say, of the printing press, which similarly came along with all sorts of efforts to suppress what could be said, but also kind of exploded the categories of what could be thought, what could be discussed. That's what digital technology is doing. And in moments like this, I think two things happen. One, it becomes harder to think about anything other than what's going on right now, because there's this kind of new chaos of energy that's been unleashed by the tech. But at the same time, it actually becomes more urgent to resist that temptation of just looking at the next 5 minutes, and to kind of pull back and ask, what are the fundamental questions that we're coming up against? I mean, that's kind of why the book is structured in the way that it is, along these sort of lines of 5 fundamental crises, because every day we wake up and we have some new news story that seems to come out of nowhere, that seems to deal in categories that none of us has ever heard of until about 5 minutes ago. And yet the questions that those news stories raise and the questions that our tech is forcing us to encounter are actually fundamental questions, like what's my place in the universe? What's a human being? And for answering those questions, you can't do better, as you say, than to dig into some of the ancient sources, to open, the kind of annals of history. Now, as you say, this is like really difficult for people to do. It's kind of abstract, feels sort of abstracted out of daily life. I would also note, though, that a lot of that, in my experience, comes out of a kind of propaganda campaign that was designed to convince people this stuff doesn't have anything to say to you. Western civ has got to go. It's ancient and backward. All the good ideas happened after Darwin. I mean, that's kind of another major version of this, that science has replaced theology and philosophy. And that's an opinion that can only be sustained if you never actually crack the spine of even one of the books that you're maligning. And if you actually start to read a lot of these guys, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, you'll find that they have a lot saner and clearer answers to some of our most foundational questions than the ones that are on offer from the World Economic Forum or from the kind of hyper-scientistic age. So it's really a question of kind of activation energy, which is, again, it's why I wrote the book. It's why I do what I do. It's about like inserting that stuff into people's sphere of vision, because once you do, there's just a tremendous amount, I think, of energy and attractiveness to it. But they've been shut off from it on purpose, by design in many cases, to keep them from realizing what it has to offer.
Yeah, what are the 5 crises that you speak of as afflicting a state, and how did you narrow it down to just those 5? They're very broad categories. They speak to a broad range of problems and afflictions. But what are the 5 that you chose to center on in your book?
Right. Well, there's sort of an embarrassment of riches for somebody that wants to write about crises.
To target
right?
rich
It's
environment.
Exactly. Yeah. There's just, every day it feels like there's some new crisis. But one important thing about the way the book is structured is that when I use the word crisis, I'm actually not talking about what you typically think of when the word is used in the news cycle. Because you hear this all the time, right? We have a crisis in the supply chain. There's a COVID crisis. There's this, crisis in Ukraine, all this and that. And many of those things are terrible issues that need dealing with and serious attention. But when I use the word crisis, as you suggest, I'm actually getting at something I think a little deeper. And I'm drawing on the Greek meaning of the word. The word crisis comes from a Greek verb krino, which means I judge or I make a decision. And so a crisis is a time for choosing. It's a decision point. When you have to choose between two kind of fundamentally irreconcilable ways of looking at the world. And that's what the five crises in this book are. They are kind of foundation level questions that are lurking a lot of the time behind or underneath the immediate questions of the politics of our day. So the first one is the crisis of reality, and that's the question, is there such a thing as absolute truth? Can we believe that somewhere, no matter how distantly we have to approach it, no matter how difficult it is to know, can we believe that there's something which is true all the time and everywhere, regardless of who says otherwise? Or is it all just kind of my truth, your truth? And I started with that one because it's the question you have to address before anything else, I think. It's the one that you have to really begin with before you can proceed to have the rest of the conversations in the book, which are the crisis of the body. What's the point of being a human being at all? Should we just kind of float up out of our bodies and reconfigure them using our technology or with transgender surgery or what have you? Or is there something essential about what we are as human beings, as embodied souls? And that concept of the soul, that idea that there might be something more to us than just our flesh, kind of leads into those next two crises, the crisis of meaning and the crisis of religion. And these are both about what's beyond the stuff that we've been told is an exhaustive description of reality. Is there anything more than just science, just atoms bouncing off of each other? And if there is, what? And then finally, once those sort of crises have been addressed, I turn at the very end to a more concrete question, which is like, what the heck is going to happen to America? And what is going wrong? Crisis of the regime. What's America supposed to be? And why does it feel as if we've fallen so far from that, as if we've gone so very wrong? So those are the five, and they're structured kind of to give not a comprehensive overview of everything you could ever encounter, at least some tools for thinking through each new question in more of a framework than just, oh, what does Don Lemon say about it? Like, what did I read in the news?
Mm-hmm. How does the abandonment of faith, which is so pervasive throughout the West, more in Europe than the United States, but certainly very true in the United States as well, and sort of it's the abandonment of faith in the heritage of Western civilization, sort of explain wokeness. Why is faith essential to a belief that life has meaning? I mean, because people would say, well, my life can have meaning without that. Why is faith important?
So there is a line in the Psalms. It's pretty famous. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. And I think for a long time, I read that just kind of simply as, atheists are dumb. It's like dunking on atheists, right? And fair enough, I'm here for that. But actually, I don't think atheists are any dumber than the rest. We're all basically as dumb as everybody else when it comes down to it. I think there's a deeper meaning to that line that kind of explains the answer to your question. And that is, if you tell yourself that you're not worshiping something, if you tell yourself you have no God, you've made yourself into a fool. You're kind of kidding yourself. It's like an act of self-deception. And so what happens when you tell yourself that you don't worship anything, that there's no higher power, that science can explain everything, what you actually do is you start worshiping without realizing that you're worshiping, because you're always going to put something in that position of highest good. Just by waking up in the morning and getting out of bed, implicitly you acknowledge that there's something you want to do, even if it's just to pour yourself a cup of coffee. Well, why do you want the coffee? Because I'll wake up and go to work. Why do you want to go to work? So that I can have money, so I can seek pleasure, right? There's going to be some purpose behind everything you do. And when you get to the purpose that just is good in itself, that you just want because you want it, that you love because you love it, then you've met your God. You have met the thing that you will bend the knee to, no matter what else may happen. And just because you don't call it a God, just because you say there is no God, doesn't mean that you're not worshiping, that you're not serving something. And I think what we've seen across the board, all over the political landscape, is a whole new kind of crop of false pagan religions, pseudo-gods, people kneeling and begging for absolution at the feet of Black Lives Matter protesters, or Dr. Fauci claiming, I am the science. I represent this kind of occult knowledge, and I get to make all moral and political decisions in the name of that power. These are not political claims. They're not scientific claims. They're religious claims. They're attempts on the part of the human heart to fill that void of the highest good with science, with politics, with whatever. And wokeness has that character. It's a kind of fervor of passion and meaning that it doesn't actually have anything to do with, scientific claims or with rational argument. It has to do with fervid religious conviction, with passionate belief in certain unfalsifiable claims, like a man can turn into a woman just by saying so. These are religious ideas, and so it's maybe less a matter of the decline of faith and just the misplacement of faith, right? Just the way that people have denied themselves access to anything beyond the physical and the political world, and they've just offloaded all of that religious energy, all that worship into that world, into the world of science and politics. And a lot of wokeness, I think, can be explained that way, which is why in the crisis of religion section, I have a passage in the book where I say, I would love for everybody to convert to my religion. That would be great, but I'm actually not here to proselytize to that. I'm just here to suggest that you're already worshiping, and so you ought to ask yourself the question: what's worthy of worship? What deserves to be in that position of the highest good? Because, spoiler alert, it's not actually Dr. Fauci, right? It's not actually the WEF or BLM. There's a better way to worship that will set you free rather than putting you in chains.
Now, you write a lot about the way, you just alluded to it, the way science has become sort of a primitive pagan faith for a lot of people. How did that work during the coronavirus pandemic? And how is it affecting us even after it's over? Of course, belief in science, people believe in science except when they don't believe in science.
Right.
It comes to gender or, when does life begin? They're very arbitrary about that, but they still seem to have this belief that is, the proper faith.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier in our conversation this idea that all the good answers to all the important questions were thought up after Darwin. And that comes from a quote by this paleontologist, G.G. Simpson. And he says, basically we should ignore everything that happened before Darwin. And this is picked up by Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionary biologist, author of The Selfish Gene, inventor of the concept meme. So it's a very prevalent and powerful idea that there was, a kind of big bang of all knowledge in the 1800s. And after that, science was going to explain everything. It wasn't just going to give us answers to physical questions. It was going to give us, a total explanation of our place in the universe, our journey out of primordial chaos into, humane perfection. And that story was going to replace all the old myths. Now, unfortunately, science itself doesn't actually furnish anything like that kind of a story. It is a description of how the mechanical processes of nature work, but it doesn't contain any kind of. It contains a lot of ises, but no oughts. There's no statement from nature about what would be good to do, about virtue above and beyond physical strength and survival. And so we always have to supply those for ourselves from some mythological source, and that's why science has become not just a set of facts or a procedure for empirical observation, but a kind of mythology and a sort of religion. The origin story comes from kind of blind Darwinian evolution. The teleology of it comes from the kind of perfection of technology that we're supposed to anticipate in the future when all disease is wiped out and death is conquered and we can upload our consciousnesses to the cloud. And this mythology, this sort of scientific religion, is what we saw at work everywhere during COVID. We saw it all the time. This idea that you should be satisfied with a life lived over Zoom because your body is kind of an outdated ape brain machine. It's like you ought to want to transcend it as quickly as possible and move on to some new post-human, transhuman world. And therefore, it's fine to cut off all of the kind of more earthy human parts of our experience in favor of mere life, of just continuing life as long as possible, eliminating death, this sort of supposed idea that we were going to wipe out all risk, and that we were going to write some equation, some political equation that would come up with the answer and shut off all debate to what we ought to do. And this is an old, progressive idea that somewhere out there, there's a system, a machine, a bureaucracy, an equation that can give you the definite right answer, the way there's a definite right answer to, an integral in calculus from a certain range of inputs to another. And that's just not how humanity works. That's a kind of myth about science as God, science as like a total description of the world. And we saw during COVID how totally unsatisfying that religion is. You end up lighting prayer candles to Dr. Fauci. People were literally doing this. You can still find it. And I think that even though, the pandemic, for all intents and purposes, is over, although there's lots of people, I'm sure, out there who would say, no, it's still going on. It's actually perpetual.
And they're wearing masks, walking around outside, as we know. So.
Still. In the car, outside, anywhere. Right. So there's definitely people who are, wedded to that dimension of this forever. But even more deeply than that, I think the conviction, the ideology that there's going to be a kind of grand scientific solution to all of our problems is still totally evident. Once you see it this way, you can see it everywhere. Even in the whole AI thing that's kind of cropped up now, that everybody is gonna, we're gonna rocket forward into this AI future, and it's either going to be our total salvation or our total destruction, depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. But everybody is convinced that this is going to become some kind of totalizing, transformation of humanity, because we believe that tech and science can sort of save us, can give us some kind of apocalyptic vision into the future, which is a far cry from anything that Isaac Newton or Johannes Kepler would have recognized as science. I mean, this is not just science. This is the mythology, the religion of science, and it's really operative far beyond COVID, although COVID is where we all started to see it most clearly.
Yeah, it really speaks to a spiritual crisis that was there and is still there, but which was, as you say, terribly exposed. You speak, in the book about the crisis of the body. And when you say that, the immediate reference that most people will make is the debate over the transgender craze and the way it seems to have taken over so much of our culture. But does it go deeper than that? And what do the philosophers of the past, what does Aristotle and all of the wisdom of Western civilization have to teach us about all of this? How can we navigate it through the great books?
This is an excellent example of an area in which it really pays to study the long view of history and philosophy, because as you indicate, the minute you hear about the human body and the soul in the body, the news cycle sort of story that's going to come up immediately to mind is the transgender mania, craze, the explosion in gender dysphoria, the massive uptick in especially young girls, but young people generally feeling discomfort in their bodies, wanting to change them with hormones and surgery. And this is very shocking and alarming, and to a lot of people, and rightly so. But because it's so shocking, it's easy, I think, to feel like it's impossible to understand. This is kind of a crazy mania that came out of nowhere. If you grasp that the relationship between body and soul is actually an ancient problem, then you'll start to see that the trans craze is only one symptom of this larger issue that we're having, this crisis over what the relationship is between our bodies and whatever else the rest of us is. Because even though a materialist would happily tell you that you're nothing but the firing of neurons, you're just a kind of, a meat sack with a chemistry set inside, we all know that that doesn't capture what we are. That everything that is important about us, our dreams, our desires, our beliefs, can't be boiled down onto a brain scan or a hormone measurement. There's actually something in us that is more than flesh, even though it comes through the flesh. And this is a famously hard problem, an ancient problem, and it's a very, very old answer to this set of questions is to simply say, well, the body is just an accident. It's a sort of imposition. It's the prison in which our perfect divine spark is held. What you might now call your gender identity, which is sort of a disembodied concept, needs to be released from the prison of its flesh. And this idea goes back at least to the Neoplatonists, to followers of the great philosopher Plato, who sort of wanted to get out of the flesh, the world of the flesh altogether, and ascend to be at one with the divine all. And the problem is this deal never pans out the way that it's offered. And we're seeing that now in the transgender movement as these kind of horrific images come out of what people have to do to their bodies, what parents and doctors do to children in order to satisfy this longing to kind of reconfigure the flesh in accordance with some divine spark. And the reason for that is the same reason why it's sort of intuitively horrifying to imagine a world where we're all sort of strapped into virtual reality machines and where we've escaped our bodies in that way through sort of tech transhumanism, which is
the Matrix.
The Matrix, yeah. I mean, there's so many dystopian stories about this, and yet it's now kind of a legitimate business proposal to suggest to people, like, you ought to strap on a pair of goggles, live in the Matrix, live in the world of Ready Player One, whatever. This idea is incredibly dehumanizing, and it ultimately ends up being kind of unpopular when its real ramifications are shown. Because the truth of the matter is, our bodies aren't a mistake, and our souls, our minds, are not an illusion. The two are fused together. Aristotle, whom you mentioned earlier, is the philosopher who really helps us, I think, to understand this, because he has this idea which we call hylomorphism. It's a kind of fusion of two Greek words. One is hule, which means like stuff or matter. The other is morphe, which means form or shape. And so fusing these two things together, forming clay, forming matter and material into a shape, is what makes something what it is. And human beings are no different. We are embodied souls. Our bodies are like the language in which our souls are expressed, or to draw upon the sort of scriptural version of this, it's when God breathes the breath of life into the physical dust of the earth that the two together become an embodied soul. These things are kind of inseparable from one another, and trying to get out of that or reconfigure our flesh or abandon it altogether leaves us sick, disfigured, and miserable.
And by phrasing it that way, I might add that this is rooted in the basics of, Judaism, Christianity, as well. It's in our basic texts. It's in our prime sources in the Torah. So it's not out of nowhere.
That's a great point. I mean, this is one area in which classical wisdom, Jewish scripture, and later Christian interpretation philosophy about that scripture, I'm thinking especially of Thomas Aquinas, these guys all kind of come together in a sort of mysterious union. Very, very different civilizations, different traditions, that nevertheless all are recognizably Western and all in conversation with one another, agreeing that we can't be split up into two, that we're actually a kind of irreducible union of those two things, and especially the kind of convergence between Jewish scripture and Aristotelian philosophy is to me really marvelous, really, really shocking, because unless this were something essentially true, something urgently woven into the fabric of human nature, you wouldn't expect somebody like Aristotle and the author of Genesis to have kind of recognizably similar anthropologies. They come from totally different worlds, and yet they're both, I think, touching upon this essential truth that mankind, Adam, is, the neshama, the breath of life, fused with the dirt, with the Adam, to become a nefesh chaim, to become a living soul. Those things are kind of inextricably bound together, even now, and trying to tear them apart is just never a good deal.
You write of the need to acknowledge that even those who say they reject Western religion philosophy are still living their lives as if they had greater meaning beyond the immediate material values. I mean, you alluded to it before, but just what does that mean, that everybody is actually still seeing their lives beyond the immediate, beyond what they think are the scientific facts, and whether they know it or not?
There is something that I really love about the dialogues of of Plato, a feature that's sort of, I think, underappreciated maybe about Plato, if anything about Plato can be said to have ever been underappreciated. Plato portrays his teacher Socrates, this kind of barefoot mystic wandering through the streets of Athens and talking with the young men, the ambitious young men there. And it's in kind of representing that experience of knowing Socrates that Plato gives birth to the Western philosophical tradition in many ways. And one thing that Socrates is constantly doing in those dialogues is he's showing that there's no such thing as halfway relativism. It's very fashionable to sit around in a college seminar or on a dorm room floor and say, oh, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Custom is king. This is all kind of a matter of convention.
The quote from Hamlet, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, in his madness, right? I mean, Hamlet is pretending to be mad or actually going mad, depending on how you read the play. But that sort of raving of a supposed lunatic is a real claim that you'll hear made in a lot of, philosophy seminars now, that this is just kind of all a matter of convention. True and false is kind of just a social construct and so forth. Now, the idea that that's true has certain radical implications, like that you and I can never have anything like approaching a conversation because your truth and my truth are sort of fundamentally irreconcilable. So you actually break down the ability to do or say anything. In one of Plato's dialogues, it's recorded that there was a follower of some of the kind of ancient relativists who took this to its rational conclusion and spent his whole life just moving his finger because it was impossible to make any claims that were true. Unless you're prepared to do that, then your relativism is going to be empty words. You're going to say it in the seminar, but you're going to go out there and live as if there were truths about the world. And we see this all the time. And, kind of people who will mouth the pieties of cultural relativism, but then make claims to social justice with this real revolutionary fervor that we ought to do this because it is right, because it is good, because the marginalized and the oppressed need to be taken care of. And those moral convictions, which are presented in profoundly absolute terms, I think give the lie to the idea that we can ever kind of get rid of or get away from this Western tradition of seeking absolute truth. And so people every day, even when they accuse somebody like, say, Thomas Jefferson or the American founders generally, when we accuse them of being evil, racist, misogynists because, for instance, some of them held slaves, right? The next question becomes, well, okay, but who taught you that it's wrong to hold slaves? Where does that idea come from? It doesn't just drop out of the sky. Most people in most places at most times have not believed that. And so where does that idea come to you from? It comes from the claim that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, which is an American claim made by the founders, drawing on this tradition of scripture, especially in that case, talking about Genesis, right? And so if we believe that they were wrong to hold slaves, which we do, we believe that in terms handed down to us from the very people that we now despise, because all men are broken, all men are flawed, and if we only take advice from people that are perfect, we'll only take advice from ourselves because we supposedly are so moral and good. But in point of fact, of course, even the words that we use to condemn our ancestors, our forebears, are freighted with the truths that they preserved for us. So yeah, we're always, I think, cutting off our nose to spite our face when we make these kinds of accusations against Western civilization on its own terms.
Yeah, that is so true. So much of your book and your writing is about the abandonment of Western civilization by the academy, and that certainly seems to be reflected in so much of what is happening in both elite institutions and most other schools. But what's the answer? Do we have to abandon institutions that have been captured by the woke and the Marxists? Start our own schools? What should parents of college-age students do?
Well, I do think that this is one of the most tricky kind of prudential questions in front of us. The ancient virtue of phronesis or practical wisdom is the virtue of taking these big abstract ideas and surveying the many sort of imperfect options in front of you and using the ideals to choose between the imperfect options and build a strategy around that. And we are, I think, in a transitional moment in American civilization especially, but Western civilization more generally, where a lot of these institutions have so squandered their reputation and their public trust that they may indeed be beyond repair. I mean, I have to apologize for the names on my degree with greater fervor each time I say them, because I just feel like these institutions are becoming like black marks. You know, they're sort of starting to really succumb to these what Godside would call the mind virus. You know, and I, you know, it's certainly true that some of those institutions might be beyond reclaim. It doesn't mean that no student ever should try to go to one to get the credentials, the inroad, what have you. But it does mean that I think our energies should be in building. I think that the internet, the online world, has provided this enormous opportunity. There are organizations that I've been working with my whole career so far, places like the Classic Learning Test, the Ancient Language Institute. I mean, these are names that don't have the prestige of a Harvard or a Yale just yet, but they're quickly becoming more trustworthy as routes to learning than the kind of big names of the Ivy Leagues. I mean, another name that I would throw in there would be Hillsdale, the college where people can go, now university, where, I think a degree from Hillsdale is probably a better guarantor of education now than a degree from Yale or Harvard, sad to say. It's not that there aren't good people at both places. It's that, institutionally, a lot of these old organizations have really lost the plot. And that's something which, it's the world of philosophy, the search for truth has always sat uneasily with institutional power. I mean, that's why they had Socrates killed. The institutions don't do well with genuine openness to truth and to good ideas. And so it is periodically the case that you have to rebuild, you have to refound. I think we're in that era. When people ask me where to send their kids, I say, look at Hillsdale, look at Thomas Aquinas, look at the Ancient Language Institute, think about learning a trade. I mean, all of these things are sort of freshly available through the internet. But it's a tough time because we're in this transition period where those things are still getting their feet underneath them. But that's what I would suggest is, look to the future, because a lot of these institutions really are crumbling.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that you've written about is trying to explain the whole idea of the multiverse, which is familiar to those who watch the Marvel superhero movies, as well as other science fiction sources. This relates, in your mind, to the crisis of meaning and faith. What should we think about this, and how does this work?
Yeah, well, we talked at length earlier about the mythology of scientism, not the practice of actual science, the study of the natural world, but the whole kind of apparatus of religious belief, quasi-religious belief that grows up around science when it turns into a totalizing description of the world. And what's really interesting is that, like any religion, scientism comes along with its popular myths. They look a lot like the Greek myths. They involve superhuman beings who represent sort of local political entities, or they represent, powers of nature. You have, people like Thor who wield the thunder, but you also have Superman who stands in for the American way, truth, justice. These are our Greek myths. They always have been. They've always been, they've always served the role in America's public consciousness, I think, that Greek myths served in ancient Greece. Now that science is our sort of chief source of myth-making, the Marvel movies, which have become hugely popular, have started to pick up the ideas of science as if they were keys to the kind of core of the cosmos, to the most urgent things about mankind and its place in the universe, which is why the multiverse, which has always been a kind of plot device in the Marvel comics, has now become the kind of driving idea behind so many of those films. It's because multiversal physics of one kind or another, either through the route of kind of the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics or string inflationary cosmology, whatever route you take, the idea of the multiverse has become very popular. And there's a reason for it, which is that it explains away what might otherwise be indicators of divine design. Our universe is very finely calibrated to make life possible, conscious life possible. There are all sorts of parameters that seem for no necessary reason to be minutely tuned to support life. And in order to get out of this, a radical secularist might say, well, ours just happens to be the universe that was coughed up by the monkeys at the typewriter. The universe-producing machine made ours, and we live in the one that can make life. Now, what's interesting about this is, first of all, that it doesn't actually answer the question, right? Because if the universe-producing machine made the universe with life, well, who made the universe-producing machine? But it kicks that can far enough down the road that you don't have to look at it. And then proposes this whole cosmic system where you basically live in one among an infinite array of possible universes. And this idea has become incredibly popular, not just the Marvel Universe, but Everything Everywhere All at Once, which won the Oscar. All these stories have kind of harkened back to this idea as if it sort of explains everything about us. What's interesting as an artistic conceit, though, is that one thing art does is it reveals sort of the human truths, the emotional truths at the core of an idea. And the multiverse does exactly the opposite. It doesn't explain anything about us. In fact, it actually makes all of our choices meaningless, because everything you do, some other version of you is doing something else somewhere else, which is why the Marvel movies are increasingly schlock, sad to say. It's everything that happens, every time somebody dies, the next movie, if they think they can make more money out of this actor, they're going to resurrect him, or he's going to come up in some new version. And that's because the multiverse is a fundamentally nihilistic concept. It's designed to take the meaning out of the universe, which is one indicator. It's not a proof, but it's one indicator that the purely material description of the universe doesn't actually get at everything we know to be true about human life. So weirdly, if you're like me and you actually pay to see these movies and you've watched them all, it actually does reap dividends in revealing something about the way that this mode of thought works. I think that the Marvel movies and the multiverse are basically like the kind of scripture of the scientistic religion, if you like.
Wow, that's that gets to the heart of it, and it's very scary as someone who was forced to watch many of them by my daughter. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, you have my sympathies. I'm sorry.
Well, some of them weren't so bad, but
that's true. There's some good ones.
But leave that aside for a moment. Let's turn to your last crises, which you speak of the crisis of the regime, which in some ways is the shortest part of your book. I mean, it was, you spend less time on that than other things. But, it clearly is something that is on our mind. How can certainly the American Republic, that this experiment, continue unmoored from the basis of Western civilization, unmoored from religion? John Adams famously said that the American Constitution was, solely, it could only work if it was for a moral and religious people. It was wholly unsuited to any other. And we're clearly becoming no longer a moral and religious people in many ways. So how, obviously that can lead to despair, which, as you write of in your book, is a sin. So where do we turn?
Well, you're right that this portion of the book, it comes at the end. It's sort of at, the last section after having dealt with all these other kind of big ideas. There does come the question, how then shall we live? And I think one reason for structuring it that way is because I want to resist holding out for people the false hope that there's some program, some list of rules, some law, some system that's going to fix this problem. As you indicate, it's really a spiritual problem, and it has to do first and foremost with getting our heads right about spiritual questions so that spiritual truth can inform our engagement with politics. But the other thing that I think we ought to resist, as you suggest, is despair. And one thing I've learned as I, have brought this book out into the world and talked to people about it is, everybody wants to know in moments like ours, this sort of tense political moment we're in, are you a pessimist or an optimist? Do you think things are going to basically get fixed, or do you think we're just headed irrevocably down the tubes? And both of those can tend to inaction. One of them tends to despair, the other tends to complacency. If you think everything's going to be fine, you might not actually do anything. But they're also both predictions about the future, which is why it's kind of pointless to argue about whether we should be pessimists or optimists, because we don't actually know what's going to happen in the future, which is good news and bad news, right? Good things might happen, bad things might happen. But the genuine truth is, and I really believe this, we do not know. We can read the tea leaves, we can try to get a sense of what might be coming, but truly we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So the real question is not, are you a pessimist or an optimist? It's, do you have hope, and where does your hope live? Because that's where you're going to have to wake up every day and work. And my hope is, as I've said, in the Western tradition, but it's in the Western tradition as embodied by the American regime, by the founding regime, the Constitution, by the creation of this thing called a republic, which is drawn from centuries of study and work on the part of ancient and modern philosophers about what the best way is to govern one another, how to balance powers against each other, and how best to live. I believe that is the greatest flower still that the Western political tradition has to offer. And so that's where I'm going to invest my energies. And that's why the last part of the book is structured in the way it is to explain just how we got here in the first place, what it was that led the founders to say what we ought to make is a republic, and the way that we ought to sustain it is through these kind of local associations. James Madison, Alexis de Tocqueville, a lot of great theorists of kind of Americanism have really stressed this, that in order to make this country run, what you need most of all is face-to-face neighborly interactions and local associations that are bound together by what the Greeks would call philia, political friendship, or even civic love. And so the book ends basically on the note of like, log off and go to church, right? I mean, that's where I draw kind of the lesson finally from what we are, what we're supposed to be, is that we're not going to save the world or even save the West by talking in these kind of grand online abstractions, by wishing for some president to sail in and fix everything. We're going to save it, I hope, by doing the hard work of waking up each day and living in civic association with our neighbors as fellow Americans first and foremost. That's where I place my hope, and I get it out of these Western traditions, and it's why, even though constitutionally I'm an optimist, as a matter of strategy and prudence, what I really endorse is putting your hope in America as founded.
Yeah, that's an important point. Go to church, go to synagogue, reach out to your neighbors, start talking to people. That's exactly what our culture is telling us not to do, because we live in a bifurcated society. Let me close by asking you quickly, where would you tell a student, no matter how old they might be, to begin in their study of the sources? And what is your next project? What is your next step as a writer?
Oh, well, thank you for asking both of those questions. I mean, obviously, I am contractually obligated, not really, but I should say that my book is a great place to start.
It is.
And my book is a great place to start. However, having said that, I always recommend to people that they actually begin by reading the Bible in its entirety. That this is something that's not actually all. You can do it in a year. There are programs out there to do it. And I'm not just saying that out of like Christian evangelism, although, of course, that's a project.
Well, it's what we do in synagogue every week. We read a portion of...
Right. Yes, exactly. I mean, you don't have to, as you indicate, you don't have to be a Christian to think that this is important. And I would suggest that you don't even have to start from a religious assumption in order to think that this is essential. So much of our language, our literary sensibility, our understanding of the world and our place in it comes from the Bible, even if we imagine ourselves to be atheists. I don't think there's any such thing as a real atheist, but even if you think that you are, you will gain an orientation and a grounding in Western civilization best by starting with the Bible. And after that, the 4 dialogues of Plato, which outline the sort of trial and death of Socrates. So the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Credo, and the Phaedo are the 4 that they're short. You can kind of wrestle with them and hold them up against the Bible and start to ask the relationship between them, and that'll set you well on your way to having a kind of groundwork of the terrain. My next project, I am working with the Daily Wire on a series of podcasts about Western civilizations. That's what I'm writing and working on, and we've actually been filming them already. So people can go to Daily Wire Plus to check that out. It will be dropping within the year.
Well, that's great. That's something to look forward to. Well, Spencer, thanks so much for joining us today. Good luck with the book as well as your future project. More on How to Save the West is a really important book, and it is a good place to start for discussing these important issues. And I want to thank you for joining us to talk about it. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're watching us live on Facebook or on Twitter, on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS-TV. Wherever it is, please like and or subscribe to this podcast. Click on the bell for notifications. Write to us. We'd love to hear from you at editor@jns.org. Tell us where you listen or watch the show and what you think of it. And also continue to watch. We'll be with you next week. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you soon.